Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Practitioner-Scholar, a Penn Chief Learning Officer podcast. This podcast is produced by the PennCLO program, which is an executive doctoral degree program at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. The program focuses on organizational learning and leadership and emphasizes a scholar-practitioner approach, meaning what is learned in the program can be readily applied to the workplace. I'm your host and also a current doctoral candidate in the program, Jess Jones, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome our guest, Dr. Carla Thomas. Now, Dr. Thomas, while you have a rich and active career in the field of inclusion and diversity, you actually started your career as a professional athlete in the WNBA, where you played for the Chicago Sky. You've been inducted into the Pennsylvania Sports Hall of Fame and the Vanderbilt Athletics Hall of Fame. You have degrees from Vanderbilt, St. Joseph's, and most recently, you completed your doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. Today, you're a faculty lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania, on the advisory board of the U.S. Naval War College, and serve as the Senior Inclusion and Diversity Education Consultant for ChristianaCare, which, to put it in perspective for our audience, means you lead strategy and education initiatives for over 14,000 caregivers in the ChristianaCare network. And in your spare time, you travel globally as a lecturer and consultant to Fortune 500 organizations in sectors ranging from healthcare to technology to financial services to retail. I am so excited to have a conversation with you today about the work you do.
I'm looking forward to the discussion myself, Jess. Although loaded, I will say, based on what you just described, I'm going to need a nap. It seems like a lot to be doing at one time.
Man, I'm exhausted just reading it.
That said, though, it's gone by really quickly, and I'm really fortunate to have had the experiences that I've had.
Well, Dr. Thomas, you have done some fascinating and I would argue essential research to provide insight into how we as individuals interact in the workplace. In particular, your research is focused on how racial biases influence our behaviors at work and what factors mitigate those biases. So, I have a number of questions for you about bias in the workplace, but before we get to those, would you mind just explaining what inspired your research in this particular area?
I'll say, quite candidly, it was my son. So I, as a person of color, have been going through the world having certain experiences that I couldn't necessarily name. And when I had the opportunity to start to understand the science around how people are seen in organizations, how their voices are heard, how we treat the dissenting opinion, how we treat the other, I said, "Oh, this is it. This is an interesting field. This is the spark of what I want to do with the rest of my life." That started a real trajectory that coincided with my son and just learning what spaces he might occupy, what are the dynamics inside of that environment, and being able to be curious as I was going in. So my research has really just been grounded in our times and trying to navigate that as a mother of a person of color.
I almost don't even know where to start. This is such an incredibly complex topic. Maybe to get us started, would you mind just breaking down a little bit what you found through your initial research?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I was endlessly curious about what, if anything, we can do to address implicit bias. The whole concept is implicit bias is a thing. There's nothing we can do about it besides maybe removing names from a resume or taking away an address, but really that we are just challenged with this way of being. And that wasn't good enough for
Mhm.
me. So I wanted to look at things that we have agency over, that we can control, things that in a lot of different settings might fall into the psychology box or the social box. I was looking at what are those things that drive change? And by extension, what are those things that we can do better? So, what I found was implicit bias is our way of understanding the world. It's how we understand that fire is hot, that water is wet. It happens in such big and small moments that it's so nuanced, it happens so quickly. We really just don't seem conscious of it. And so when you're asking someone to change something like that, like what are you really asking them to do? I found that empathy is something that you can ask people to do. So I started looking at empathy across difference. It's what's known as ethnocultural empathy. I asked questions about, does empathy really have an effect on bias? Can we reduce bias if we increase empathy? It turns out you can. It also turns out that it's only specific facets of empathy. And so I got really, really curious about those facets. I got a deeper understanding about what they mean. And then I introduced that as a practitioner into my work. to see, can we move the needle? Can we shift how organizations feel a sense of belonging? Can we reduce the need to cover inside of these spaces? Can we stop expecting folks who are going into a space like the workplace, a space where they are going to make funds to feed themselves and their families? Can we make them a little less trauma inducing? Turns out we can. And it's been fun just since exploring the research to expand upon the ways that we can build those futures.
Wow, there is a lot to unpack there. I feel like I have to ask before we get into that, though. There's been a lot of change recently in how corporations are approaching diversity and inclusion in their organizations, much of it influenced by the recent Supreme Court ruling that has struck down affirmative action in higher education. It's also really politicized the term DEI and how organizations are viewing their DEI investments. I'm curious, as you think about bringing your research to bear in the workplace to make it a better experience, how are you navigating the impact of your work in the DEI space in the recent years?
Honestly, this has been a question that I don't know a single practitioner that's in this space hasn't been wrestling with for the last at least 5 years. So the way in which I look at this today is evolving. I would say I measure impact at the smallest possible level. I also look at it in terms of system wide ripples. What I mean by that is I am inspired by Adrienne Marie Brown. I don't know if you're familiar. She's an author and a speaker and a facilitator around these subjects. And she always references this idea that small is all. And so when I think about what impact can I have when there's so much changing in the culture, in the shifts of how we talk about this and the things that are okay, sometimes that looks like maybe I can have an impact at the nonprofit level and have strategy conversations with membership organizations with a national footprint, but they're wondering whether or not they need to remove Black from the title of their name that's been in existence for 100 years. The reckoning around what does it mean to say we stand on this conversation, that we're committed to this discussion. Sometimes it means looking at the landscape and saying, okay, we're going to be in a little bit of a tenuous limbo period for a little bit until some of the dust settles and the uncertainty. And when we're sitting with that, that can feel like fear. So let's have some executive coaching conversations about fear, about how to calm the nervous system, about how to be mindful and what do I want to do as opposed to what do I want to run from. And at small levels, that's personal, that's interpersonal, which means for me, I feel comfortable where I get to explore those things. And tomorrow I'll check again.
I love that, and I love that small is all concept. I feel like, I've talked to just a lot of colleagues that are leaders in various organizations, and that fear is real, right?
Yes.
And I think there's also that idea that if I want to create greater diversity, if I want to create greater inclusion, I have to somehow do a big thing, or I have to wait for HR to implement our DEI initiative, and not really understanding it is those small everyday things that we do as leaders, as people in the workplace that can really make such a big difference. So, oh, sorry, did you have something to say there?
I mean, I guess I would just only add there's what the individual leader can do in their span of influence. And then there's acknowledging the fact that sometimes that's not keeping things silent, like saying, this is awkward, this is hard, how do I do it? Or I'm not sure where this falls in the list of priority for our organization. Can we talk about what that looks like and try to force rank it? To bring it back up in conversation, for example, that fear kind of requires us to be vulnerable in a way that models the same sort of behaviors we want to ask of our caregivers, of our employees, of our organizations as a whole. And so that ripple effect is tangible.
Wow, I love that, the small things turning into something big. And maybe this is a really good way to get to my next question, which is a small thing turning into something big. So, a small thing that started with just your initial dissertation research and has expanded out to a lot more research and work you're doing in the field. And I'm just curious, how has that evolved or even been reinforced in kind of some of the practical work settings that you're in today?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I blinked and like 5 years has passed since I completed my doctorate. I could not believe it. And when I look back now, there's sort of a body of work to be able to see how the conversation has shifted. And so for me, it's really been going down a little bit further into the mechanics. So I had this concept. Do we have a connection between implicit bias and empathy? Does it exist? I was able to show that it does. I was able to show that it's predictive. Now, what are the other metrics that are tied to this that we can identify in like a data migration project before we upload this new Workday system? Can we check in and see if there are metrics that we can attach to it? Are there things that we can look at, sort of like applied research and action research, that sees over time what this impact has on the employee life cycle, on attrition rates, on some of these levers that we think work, but we don't know for sure? What are the indicators that we can pay attention to early? I've also found that, like, invariably, like I said, you run into the cognitive side of empathy. Like, intellectually, I know that there's this thing that's happening. The behavioral of, like, I'm going to say this instead of this. But there are aspects to this that are shared emotion and that require leaning into the somatic awareness that we have about what's taking place. Before we make a decision, can I check in with myself a little bit more? And so I've leaned into a lot of the supporting mechanisms for building empathy. And they're very easy things to do. So it's been fun to explore all the different ways that empathy can show up for an org.
Can we just unpack that for a minute? That idea of the somatic piece is just fascinating to me because we talk about this idea of kind of mind and body being separate. And, I personally, for example, have learned that when I work out, it is less about my physical body and more about my mental health is
Yes.
where I really see those impacts. And I've talked to a lot of other people that have similar experiences, but we still think about these things so separate. Can you share a little bit more about the somatic impact and what that means for our empathy?
Absolutely. So the connection between the psychological and the social is really, really strong and really, really understood or under researched. Let me put it that way. There's a lot of things that are emergent here in terms of our understanding of what a physical awareness can mean for our understanding of ourselves and how we're experiencing the moment. So, say, for example, I will go through a training session and I might ask a question where, someone may have to question, how did I see that moment? How did I show up? What was my initial response? I like to say, like, it might be a situation in a learning opportunity where someone tells you water isn't wet. And so imagine hearing that. Your reaction to it is like, no, there's no way. That makes no sense whatsoever. Anything that comes out of that person's mouth, I'm not paying attention to. And so I want folks to notice the stories that we tell ourselves for why we do or don't do a thing, even if it means listening to what someone says, like water isn't wet. If you take that moment and break it down, if you slow it down a little bit, if you notice, okay, were you agitated at all when you heard me say this thing? Did you notice that your shoulders got tense when you heard that this was going to be part of the conversation, or that you were going to be having to question yourself in this way, or your lived experience, or your tenets that you hold about how the world functions, the basic foundational things? Did your gut clench up a little bit? Okay, that's data. Let's talk about what that data means. Let's talk about when you might have that same like physical sensation in different moments. And let's talk about how you can calm yourself down in that moment and be curious about what things mean. It's really very little about the sensation itself. There's some of the science there, but it's in the ability to be self-aware that in turns allows us to be more intentional in what comes next. And we can break that down to key moments, whether it's interviewing a candidate or having feedback conversations or take your pick. We can break those down into key discussions or insights in an employee's experience.
It's funny you started talking about, water isn't wet or water is wet, right? And that discussion. I found my shoulders up here like this. And then you said, "Are your shoulders tense up?" And I went, "Oh yeah." So you're spot on. So I think what I'm hearing, not surprisingly, you're spot on. You have so much experience here, but what I think I'm hearing right is that it's about that empathy and then that self-regulation and bringing that self-regulation not just here but throughout our whole body. That just seems incredibly powerful.
Yes. And it's not a small ask. So recognizing too, like for example, the tensions that middle managers might feel, navigating the employee populations that they're supporting and then also getting directives themselves, that's a tension, that's an emotional response that we have even in that. And our ability to slow down that moment and not as, okay, how am I showing up? Did the tone of my email change? Did I become a little bit less or a little bit more conservative in doling out opportunities for other folks to take on work? As have my delegation skills dropped down in those moments where there's an emotional response? It's very much like tapping into the emotional intelligence, EQ tools that you hear about in terms of moving from self-awareness to social awareness to some level of regulation.
Okay. Okay. So I wonder if we can kind of expand this world a little bit now from, the work we do in the workplace to just kind of broadly. I'm curious, what do you feel like is on the horizon for culture transformation in organizations that are trying to create inclusive spaces?
Yes. I think this is a real time in which it's important for us to acknowledge again the fear. And I say that in particular because with every email, with every communication, with every single day that passes, there's something else that happens. There's something else that occurs either at a local level or at a macro level that is like, do we respond to this? Is this something that we react to? And it's important for many organizations to recognize we've been here before, that this is not new, that it might feel novel, that it might feel difficult and challenging, and that there might feel this sense of like, I don't know what's around the corner. And it's helpful for us to pay attention to how we respond as an organization to those moments. It's helpful for us to have more communication rather than less in those moments. For folks that are practitioners in the space, I don't know of one who hasn't paused to think about, do I still want to continue to do this work? It is quite candidly, it can feel disheartening and like things are closing in to recognize that, over half the states in the United States, it's illegal for me to talk about this in certain rooms. And I talk about empathy. There's going to always be that sort of pendulum swing and that adjustment. And so I don't think it's surprising that folks in the field are questioning, can we still do this? What does it look like? And to be fair, we've been here before. Not only that, it's a time for innovation. That's exciting to me. It's a time for us to see what works and what doesn't and transform the process. And I don't care if we call it DEI. I don't care what we call it, as long as we're creating spaces where people can feel humanized, can feel valued and appreciated, where they don't have to cover pieces of themselves in order to survive. I don't care what definition we give that or what word we call it or acronym. And I'm not interested in holding on to them. And I hope other people are not taking that the wrong way, but there's room for us to reimagine.
Personally, I'm taking it as inspiration. I mean, as you started to talk about, in over half the states, it's illegal in some ways to talk about this. I started to get just really depressed, and to have you talk about it in the concept of, hey, this is a time for change. This is a time for innovation. We can do this is just really heartening and lightening and just exciting to hear about. So I really appreciate that view. I'm kind of curious. You talked about this a little bit, but can you say more? When you're in those spaces where maybe, you can't use the phrase DEI, for example, how are you talking about this? Because it sounds to me like what you're trying to get to is the heart of just creating spaces that work for people to be successful.
Yes. Yes. So there's a couple things when I'm in those spaces where there's animosity around it or there's a tension around it. I've always approached this work as not being a special subset of like organizational learning or organizational development. It is not unique to a handful of people. It is how we think about leadership in general. And so if we're having a conversation, if you think about the competencies, for example, that might come up for a leadership program or a hypo program, those things include empathy. They require empathy. It's one of those soft skills that doesn't really disappear, but it also requires just being mindful of the opportunities to insert the discussion where it's meant. We're dealing with people. So, how do we ensure that those people feel safe, feel seen, feel heard? Because we know that produces results. And how do we acknowledge the experiences of folks before they come in our doors? Is taking ownership of the culture of an organization, of the ways in which it evolves, of the ways in which it looks and approaches its talent.
I love that. I mean, I think what I heard from you is just make empathy a part of your cultural transformation.
So there's been different rooms that I've been a part of. There have been rooms that have been small and the organization is like a handful of ragtag people and we're trying to put something together. And then there have been these global organizations where they're looking at system wide issues in really powerful ways. And I don't know a single one of those rooms, big or small, in which I hope that the leaders in that space, before they make a decision, they have managed to access their empathy. Before they make whatever sort of plans that they need to make, that they have managed to access that before they go forward. And the fruit of it in the back end is there. When we're reactive, when we're cutthroat in terms of how we approach these processes, there's a fallout to that. But if we pause for half a second, how can we be intentional about who's in the room and who isn't? It's going to be one of those things we talk about for a while.
Okay, so if you had a magic wand, what would you want to invite DEI practitioners to do in this new age that you're describing?
Ah, I would say get out of echo chambers for the conversation, be able to access different ways of processing these problems, be willing to break some eggs, as they like to say. I think there's so much value, for example, in just creating community amongst other practitioners and inviting other folks to the conversation. We should be talking more to business leaders. We should be talking more to community members. We should be talking at the intersection of these spaces because ultimately we're trying to address broader societal issues that have like a sort of overlapping intersections. And if we don't see those broader contexts, we'll just be hopping from one thing to the next, hoping that it'll solve for the problem. And so just slowing down and access the different just bodies of work and amazing practitioners who are already out there already and spread around some of those good ideas. I think there needs to be communication channels that happen a lot more consistently around just those efforts.
I love that idea of getting out of our own echo chambers because we want that healthy tension, that healthy conflict, those new ideas that kind of force us into these new spaces. And that can just be so exciting. So I think that's amazing in a way to think about how do we approach this. And even as we are coming in and saying, hey, I want to have empathy, I want to do these new things, means we have to have empathy for the change that's happening around us. And that's incredibly powerful. I know we're wrapping up our time here, and I always like to just pause and recognize we're on the PennCLO podcast. And so to maybe just wrap us up, if you wouldn't mind, could you just share a little bit, what influence has your PennCLO experience and the research you were able to conduct really had on both your personal and professional journey?
It has absolutely changed the trajectory. On a personal level, I have met folks who I call family in every stretch of the imagination. They have been there for big and small moments, and I am thankful for them because it really did create a community for me to be able to lean into at various points in my career and ask, hey, how am I looking at this? Or where should I be considering in terms of like this next opportunity? I've had this thing in front of me. Is it worthwhile? Or I'm wrestling with this idea. Do you have an environment where let me bounce this off of you and any of your friends that you may know? There's that sort of side of it. But it's also, I have to say, it's been a journey that continues to unfold because time is passing. And so there are births, there are deaths, there are moments that we get to be a connection to one another. And that applies to students and faculty. It's just a beautiful community that, yeah, helped change the trajectory of my professional career as well.
Wow. Well, I can't imagine a better way to say it as someone who is very fortunate to be a part of the community too. So I think we will just end it there. And I will just say, Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for coming and sharing a little bit about a very complex topic and the work that you're doing in the space. This was just such a pleasure for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.